So we've actually done a couple of programs here at the Impact Hub about the universal basic income, because Y Combinator is going to do a pilot project where they're going to pilot the universal basic income. And what was interesting to me when they proposed the project was that instinctively I thought the universal basic income would be to supplement social services. But when we did the program, there were about 300 engineers in the room who were very interested in what would happen to them personally when they no longer had engineering jobs. And so I'm just wondering, because you are an economics reporter and that's your area, have you done any research into the effects of the universal basic income, and is it feasible on a large scale or only in a hyper-local setting?
So Carrie's question, we have actually had a number of experiments with universal basic incomes. They did one in India, in one of the poor provinces of India, and one of the first things that they discovered was that the assumption had been that a lot of people would suddenly engage in pathological behavior. They're going to gamble or drink or use drugs. No. People actually were very prudent with their money. People saved some of the money that they got. They bettered the lives of their kids. They behaved quite responsibly. If we had a universal basic income, a couple of things would happen. Nixon tried this early in his administration. You know, Nixon were running for president today. We would think of him as being to the left of Dennis Kucinich, even though he was a Republican, and on social issues. And Nixon program where they gave cash grants to people. All the women in abusive marriages left their husbands because they weren't dependent on them anymore, and they weren't going to be beaten up and raped just because they had a roof over their head for their kids. So that was quickly shut down for that very reason. We're destroying families. See, government is again destroying families. We will have a problem if it's very widespread with people having too much idle time on their hands. And, you know, idle hands in the devil's workshop is not exactly a radical new idea. So we'll have to solve that as a problem. Every solution always creates a problem. That's one of them we will face. I've thought a lot about this, and what I think we should do is have a universal basic income, and everybody gets it. Bill Gates gets it. Poorest person on the street gets it. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, it's $1,000 a person for adults. I'll get to children in a second. So that means if you couple up with somebody, for whatever the nature, you know, it's romantic, platonic, or practical, it means two people have $24,000. Now in San Francisco, that's pretty tough, but in most of the country, if you have $24,000 of tax-free income, it's just income, you can do okay. Not going to do great, but you can do okay. But then if any income you earn above that is yours, you're going to see lots of people say, wow, here's this basic stable base, and you can have a stable society. And the way I would deal with children is the value of federal tax benefits for having a child now is in round numbers $100 a month. It varies a lot by income. So we'll just have the government write you a check for $100 a month for the kid. So Rose and I have a kid, and we split up, and who gets the money, you or me?
Me.
Okay, well, no, I get it. And the answer to that is the government says we'll just hold the money and it'll collect interest until this gets resolved. And, you know, if we never resolve it, when the kid is 22, they suddenly get a check. But this actually is a very good idea, I believe. And there are some reasons to think, because I've done some back-of-the-envelope spreadsheet work on this, that if we eliminated the whole social welfare system and replaced it with this, that in fact it would be cheaper. And then we don't have to worry about the fact that we would throw all these people in the social welfare system out of work. And I have gone with people who are in the social welfare system, and the way they are demeaned, and some of these are people who, like a crime victim, who cannot work because they're a crime victim, did nothing wrong, wasn't, you know, doing anything to tempt fate. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The demeaning way they are treated like they're leeches, we might be able to eliminate that.
Why would you give it to Bill Gates?
Because the cheapest way to administer something like that is to give it to everybody. And, you know, take everybody who's very wealthy in the country, it's just not that much money. And it's going to get recycled anyway. It's just not worth the coin to take it away. We reintroduced in 2013 something called P's and Peps. The right calls them clawbacks. And for every additional $1,000 of income over a certain level, 3% of your deductions are taken away. But if you're making $10 million a year, it's irrelevant to you. It's just a way to tax the upper middle class. And so people like me, I'm in the bottom half of the 1%. The bottom half of the 1% make $400,000 to $600,000 a year, and they are overwhelmingly workers. People in the bottom 90% get 86% or 84% of their income from labor, 86% from labor. People in the bottom half of the 1% get 81% of their income from labor. They're not greatly different, they just have more money. And all these little rules to pick away at them, well, we allow people who are billionaires to live income tax free, to make a profit off the income tax. That's outrageous. So a universal basic income at a level that's just enough for you to get by would encourage people to work. Some people would say, I'm gonna stay home, drink beer, and watch baseball. Okay.
I had one follow-up. I'm sorry, I forgot one question. When you were talking about politics and voting people in office who would take action on this, I wonder what you think about the very close relationship between Silicon Valley and the Democratic Party. Because you now have a lot of Obama people. David Plouffe works for Uber. I don't remember the names, but someone else works for Amazon, someone else works at Apple, someone else works for Airbnb. I mean, the revolving door now.
And what they've done is they've turned my brother, the manual laborer, who is now disabled from cleaning out the culvert during the storm so people could get to work. He has a great observation about this for a guy with a high school education. He goes, you know, if I still had guns, we had guns when we were kids, if I still had guns, if I believed in God, or I hated gays, I'd vote for the Republicans. But I'm not any of those things. But why do I care about the Democrats? Tell me one damn thing the Democrats have done for me. I can tell you a lot of things they've done for rich people. I can tell you things they've done for you, brother. You tell me one thing they've done for me. They're being co-opted here. You know, I mean, it's reasonable to have the Republicans, well, I'm a registered Republican, to have a Republican Party that basically represents business and entrepreneurialism rather than conservatism, which I think would be much better. And then to have a party of people who work or who are ordinary folk. And the Democrats were when unions had some power, but they're not anymore. And so what both Wall Street and Silicon Valley are doing is just co-opting the liberal groups at the top. And they're very smart about how to do that, you know. They don't hire more people than they have to, they don't pay them more than they have to, but they make them comfortable. Well, they make us uncomfortable.
Chris.
There was somebody with a microphone who wanted to.
Carrie's the only question.
Okay.
Is there a microphone around?
Okay.
It seems like there's so many efforts on the Band-Aid side of things that are discussed around the gig economy that you've talked about, whether it's legislative or through labor organizing efforts. They all seem Band-Aid oriented. Given the structural nature of how capital is functioning in the gig economy, which has deep roots, as you're saying, to restructure how labor arrangements happen, do you see anything on the front end of that arrangement to try to limit or curtail the way that capital is restructuring labor?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm proposing Band-Aids. I'm proposing some real fundamental basic changes that would require that many more people be treated as employees. If we had universal health care that wasn't employer related, it would really open up the economy. If we had the French healthcare system, it would save us so much money. I'll give you a shocking number here, but you can go look up my work and you'll see that from the official data. If we had universal no out-of-pocket health care, it would save us the equivalent of all the income taxes paid by 99.3% of Americans. That is, we'd only be taxing the people who are way up there. So we need to fundamentally rework labor law to recognize the new economy, to provide balance so that people who are workers in whatever capacity have balance, and we need to have rights and responsibilities. And we've done a great job in this country of separating risk from responsibility, rights from responsibility. We need to have a campaign to restore responsibility by people at the top. Just as a practical matter, I don't see organizing working for people who have disparate interests. It's hard enough just to organize one factory, even when the labor laws were favorable to doing that. So I think government policy is a better way to get at this. And as for the issue of what do we do about the fundamental structure of capitalism, we need to have broad ownership of capital. We need to do what the founders said. Everybody should own their land, they should own their tools, they should have some property of some kind. And we've had lots of research. The Ford Foundation in particular has done research about, I think they were called IDAs, individual development accounts. A lot of people, if the transmission falls out of the car, they're in a disaster. And they end up with things like these predatory lenders and the payday lenders. But if people have some savings, they can get through these things and through these shocks. And so there's a piece I wrote for the New York Daily News that's, you're in favor of Bernie even if you don't know it. Bernie's policies. 70% of Republicans in this country favor bigger Social Security benefits, and about 61 or 2% will pay higher taxes to get bigger benefits. These are Republicans we're talking about. And so in terms of the gig economy and the structure of capital, we have to have different rules. And we have in 21 states that I know of, and it may be more now, we have repealed something called the rule against perpetuities. Every law student has to learn this. What it basically means is you can't say I'm creating this trust forever. You can create it for the lifetime of the youngest beneficiary alive the day you create it, plus 21 years. It's a practical matter. You can create a trust for about 120 years, right? You have a newborn great-great-grandchild. They're going to live to be 80, and then there's 21 years, and your trust is going to go 100, 120 years. We've repealed that. We create now what are called dynasty trusts. And that money is locked up forever. And we gotta, that is what brought the French Revolution about. Everything was locked up by the church and the state. And we need to have a dynamic economy, and that means that capitalism has to turn over one way or another. Capital has to turn over. If I make $1 billion in my lifetime, that's great. My children are not entitled to it. We need to figure out how to get that then recycled back into the economy. So other people have opportunity. By the way, the Athenians figured that out. 2,500 years ago, the Athenians figured this out.
So why aren't we having this conversation? Why isn't, I mean, we're having this conversation. On a higher level where, you know, I mean, the acknowledgement, I remember when Robert Reich said, the majority of Americans, or there are a lot of Americans who are nervous, and like everyone poo-pooed this was under Clinton, under Bill Clinton, and yet 9 months later, it was, you know, in the business section.
Well, why are we having? The real question is why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, what kind of society do we want?
We're not having a conversation for a couple of reasons. First of all, the institutions that were a voice for ordinary people have all been weakened. How many of you went to Sunday school or its equivalent as a child? Raise your hand. Almost nobody. My students have no religious training at all. The mainstream Protestant churches in America are way down. The Catholic Church has radically cut back. The Jews and Muslims are a small minority of people. There's been a radical falling off of the moral teaching of young people, okay? Unions did a lot of work and with the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church and Jewish organizations to promote social justice. They've shrunken away to nothing. The news media, and this was not universal, but the San Jose Mercury was one of the leaders in this, and the LA Times, very fat, rich papers. They did marketing research, and I remember going up and getting the brochures once. Subscribers to the Los Angeles Times are 162% more likely to buy a Mercedes-Benz than non-subscribers. And so advertisers were drawn, and the demographics became, instead of being a mass market, when I was a boy in Orange County, when I was in first and second grade, I remember there were lots of households that got 2, 3, 4 newspapers. And they were very different in their content. I didn't know that then. I've gone back and read them. But now it's monopoly newspapers, and they're focused on advertisers. We cover banking from the point of view of the banker, not the bank customer. And the people you see on national television, Katie Couric's annual pay, when she was the anchor at CBS, was greater than the entire budget of All Things Considered and Morning Edition on NPR. There are TV journalists who get paid $4 or $5 million a year. They live in a world where, you know, there was a there was a reporter hired at the New York Times who I remember telling me that he didn't understand why I was writing all this stuff. The world was just fine. And I looked at him and I said, well, where did you grow up? Well, it was in an apartment on Park Avenue in the 80s. Oh, really? And what did Daddy do? Well, it turns out Daddy is like a very big name in town, which I didn't know. The minute he said it, I drew the connection. And we had reporters at the New York Times we had a couple of them who were worth many tens of millions of dollars. And if I grew up in a household like that, I'd probably say, gee, the world seems just. So our news media at the top now is filled with people who have an enormous amount of money, and because there isn't competition the way we used to have, in TV there's too much competition, so nobody has the money to do anything, we're not seeing a lot of discussion of these issues. And on top of all of that, the campaign finance system. If you were elected to Congress, you would behave like every other member of Congress, or you would be out. I had a guy who was a state senator for 10 years who just happened to get in a cab with me at the airport. We were standing together, so let's take a cab. A good guy, and from a very rich family, and who said to me, he's a Democrat, and he said, you know, every morning when I was in the Senate, I would shave and I would think about what I had to do that day to keep my 10 biggest donors happy. And I said, why? And he said, because if they weren't happy, they'd run somebody against me and I'd be out. And I like being in the Senate. I enjoyed this. And he said, but you know, you've made me think of something. I can't recall ever looking in the mirror and saying, what am I going to do today for the ordinary constituent I'll never meet? And that's people responding to the economic incentives. So that's why I've suggested that members of Congress should have an unlimited expense account, but everything has to be documented. And I'm going to be a little hyperbolic here, but you know, if a lobbyist lights your cigarette, we march out the steps of the Capitol and shoot you. We've got to break this dependence on this narrow group of donors. And it's a lot of work. But we got rid of slavery, we got child labor laws, women got the right to vote, we got union laws. Under a Republican president, we got pretty damn good environmental laws, though they're now being undone during the Nixon era. We can make the country whatever we want to make it, but we have to do the work. And step one, people have to decide they're fed up and then start acting.
To the point about the New York Times, I remember, so David Brooks has a column in the New York Times. He's on the PBS NewsHour on Friday. He's on NPR's All Things Considered, I think, on Friday. And he had a column recently about Trump and about people who are suffering. And he just had an epiphany and finally realized people are suffering out in the country. I'm going to have to spend more time outside of my bubble. And I thought, this guy has such a microphone and he just now realized that people are suffering. My friend just got back from Washington, D.C. and couldn't believe how many homeless people were in Washington, D.C. And that's where he lives. So that's a problem. The other thing is, over the last couple months, Jane Mayer, New Yorker writer, wrote an amazing book called Dark Money. And it's about the Koch brothers and really what they've done at the state level, which is not really getting much attention. North Carolina was their testing ground. They went into North Carolina with this bathroom law. They took moderate Republicans by surprise with these hardcore conservatives that they ran in North Carolina. And the media is not making a connection between the Kochs and these bathroom laws. Jane Mayer has not been on television to talk about her book. Thomas Frank was recently on my show, Listen Liberal. He's kind of woken up to the Democratic Party and how they're not really giving people anything. It's sort of like, well, if you don't vote for us, you're going to get Trump, right? Thomas Frank has not been invited on any of the cable shows. Wendell Potter, who used to be an executive with Cigna, he wrote a new book about money and politics. And he wrote about how there are these call centers right next to the House and the Senate. And these politicians go into these call centers. They're just little cubbies. And all day long, they make phone calls and talk to rich people to give them money. And there was this story about this one congresswoman who had to listen to a woman, very wealthy woman in LA, who got ugly curtains in the mail. And she was really angry about it. But because this politician needed the money, she sat there on the phone and listened to this woman complain about her curtains. Okay, these are amazing stories. Wendell Potter said his publisher gave him a booking publicist, which is pretty unusual these days. They were blatantly told by TV producers, sorry, it's all Trump all the time. We're not going to book you. Now, luckily, David hasn't had that experience because you're going to be on MSNBC this weekend, right?
Yeah, Saturday morning. But I used to be in Fox all the time, and I would correct hosts about things until one day I corrected a host who said something, and it was Lou Dobbs, who when I was at CNN and I would correct Lou would go, I didn't know that. And sometimes once he said, I got to have you back on tomorrow. But at Fox, it's not the policy, and I mean, it's a real problem. People who have, Jane Mayer has written a very important book, Dark Money, about how the system works. She's not getting out there.
Yep.
And Rupert, there's a story that a guy named Gabe Sherman, who's been covering Roger Ailes and wrote a terrific book about him and what he's doing as the head of Fox, got people inside Fox to tell him that the reason Fox has now sidled up to Trump is their data shows that when they say something negative about Trump, people who watch Fox turn the TV off. When they rah-rah for him, their numbers go up, which means they make more money and they have more power. And this is just awful. This is just absolutely awful. And there's nothing we can do about it. And I say this to you, by the way, as the only journalist in American history who caused a broadcaster to be forced off the air. 6 stations for news manipulations and blackouts. What they were doing is no longer subject to getting you thrown off the air. These guys that I exposed 43 years ago. And by the way, the most profitable TV station in America, according to Forbes. We're not getting rounded coverage of these things because all of the economic incentives are against them. And we got to have movements where people address all of these things.
Yeah, and the CEO of CBS, Les Moonves, at a recent gathering with investors, basically said, keep going, Trump, keep getting out there, because he's making them so much money. So that's why.
You got anybody else for a question?
Other questions?
Well, thank you for coming, David. A long-time fan of your books. Got one here. Maybe you'll get a chance to sign it.
I'm happy to get one signed.
And a big fan of Rose Aguilar and Public Press. I have a couple of things I wanted to throw out there, maybe as statements and maybe sort of as questions as well. Been very happy to read Douglas Rushkoff's book recently, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, and it's kind of about how growth has become the enemy of prosperity. And the reason I bring that up is because he talked a lot about something that was mentioned tonight here about a basic income. And this makes so much sense to me. I mean, as a person who, I'm a 44-year-old woman, I'm basically a full-time mom. I'm a very lucky person in that my husband has an elite education, so we're happy to be in some level of privilege. But nevertheless, as a 25-year resident of San Francisco and somebody who currently lives in the Mission and sends her daughters to public schools, it feels like I almost live at ground zero a little bit because there's so much going on in the community. So I wanted to know if you know of Rushkoff and his work and other discussions about a universal basic income. And Rushkoff is talking about, well, there's a lot of automation and maybe it's going to take away people's jobs, but maybe the takeaway from this is maybe we should all work less. Isn't automation supposed to help us all out and let us relax a little bit more? And I'm like, boy, is that a great idea. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And the second thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, a little bit about unions. And it's something that you've talked about a lot and a lot of people talk about a lot. I'm a little bit incredulous when I hear things about unions. I mean, I spent 23 years in the paid labor force, and 13 of that I spent working in the restaurant business, including being like my first restaurant job as a 17-year-old IHOP waitress in Kennesaw, Georgia. Worked for $1.80 an hour plus tips as a high school senior. Anyway, worked long hours without breaks and the whole 9 yards. So never was approached by a union, never got invited to join a union. What we're seeing right now in San Francisco, and I am a crime survivor myself, and we're seeing just today, as you began your talk, the breaking news was that the police chief in San Francisco finally resigned. This is a very powerful union. Our police chief in San Francisco makes $400,000 a year.
What's the question about unions?
Well, I just wanted to know, in terms of the unions, it seems like the most powerful unions and the only unions with any power right now in these Democratic Party strongholds like San Francisco are the police unions, and they're very brutal. They're very much against the interests of working people.
The unions that are most successful are, first of all, public worker unions. Secondly, they're the unions of very high-paid jobs. All the major sports teams, which are just public welfare programs, those are unionized, baseball, football, etc. Airline pilots are unionized. So unions don't generally represent people who are in unskilled jobs anymore. And in Georgia, you can't have a union as a practical matter because it's a right to get paid less state. Unions are not perfect. There are all sorts of problems with unions, and there are unions that have been run very well and ones that have been totally corrupt. And how does this make them different from companies? I don't know of any union that machine gunned women and children in their tents as the Rockefellers did in 1905. You can go read about it. I don't know of any unions. Huh?
To be fair, the police union, they killed a lot of
No, I understand. No, I'm talking about this is the company, the Rockefellers, through their companies, machine gun women and children in Colorado. The world isn't perfect. There are bad unions, there are good unions, there are bad companies, there are good companies. The problem is that given the nature of where we're going, the degree of automation, the disconnection, and the lack of other support, I'm a big union guy. I just don't think that's the direction the world is going to go. I wish it would. I think we'd be better off if we had strong unions. And remember, America was settled by people who came here to escape unions. They couldn't get into the guilds in Europe, so they came here to have a better life. Therefore, there is this long history of anti-unionism in America as a result. We have real serious problems with police. I'm the guy who changed the reputation of the LAPD. I was the first person to seriously take them apart. And we have major problems with our police departments in this country that we need to address. And one thing I will tell you is there's an enormously lot less police violence today, even with all the things we see because of body cams, than there was in this country in the 60s and the 50s and the 20s. Awful as it is, it's not as bad as it's been in the past. But we need to, we need, that's an area where it's not labor law that's the problem. It's not that the police are unionized that's a problem. It's that the law does not match responsibility and power together. Police should have discretion, but we give too much discretion and we don't have mechanisms to hold them liable. In England, if you do an improper or illegal search, in America, nothing happens to you. In England, you're a cop, bad things happen to you. And so the police are much more cautious and careful about respecting the law.
I think it's a symbiotic relationship, though, with the Democratic Party, very much, because, the police unions especially.
Oh, well, yeah, the unions have always been basically aligned with the Democrats, with a few exceptions. The Teamsters got themselves in bed with the Republicans because the Democrats tried to clean them up and get the mob out. And the professional sports unions have, at times, been very aligned with the Republicans.
And I'm not trying to bash it, because I'm just trying to say, in terms of the big picture, this is what I see when I hear about unions. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
David, this has been very interesting, and I'm glad you're back here in San Francisco to talk about these things. But it does seem to me that you're not providing any alternatives or talking about any of the alternatives. There is an alternative press. There is a KALW. There is a public press. Chris Cook has a very good website. So does Tim Redmond. The Guardian is gone, alas. But Tim Redmond is doing 48hills.org. SFBG.com just came out with the Guardian endorsements, which have been done now for 50 years. Every city has now got alternative press either on the ground or in the air, and there are alternatives. And your career has always been on the big side, and you have been an alternative on all these papers. I don't know how the hell you kept your job all these years. That's what you ought to be telling us about, how the hell you did it. Anyway, is there some hope that you see out there?
Well,
I see quite a bit, but I just wonder if you do.
This is Bruce Brugman, who founded and ran the Bay Guardian, and who has been fundamental to exposing corruption in this city for decades. First of all, I'm generally in the diagnosis business more than the solution business, and I confess that. I'm not a community organizer. I'm an investigative reporter, and my job is finding things out, deep structural things, and exposing them. I'm not particularly good on solutions, partly because mainstream press regards any suggestion of a solution by a reporter as biased, as I was literally told by the editors of the New York Times.
That's your key point.
I agree.
Because the alternative provides solutions.
That's right.
And they're
And so-
and they're stories.
That's right.
So
So
don't worry about bias. My
So the San Francisco Public Press that Michael Stoll has founded engages in something and is working on a project, I'm not going to say exactly what it's about, that Michael calls reverse investigative reporting. And what? Yeah, investigative reporting in reverse. And that is to go at, well, why haven't we solved this problem, or what haven't we done about it? And I hope that all of you pick up some copies. There's no ads in it. Whatever flaws you think you find, this is as pure work as you're ever going to find, and they need your money to do it. We need to get all these rich people in this town. We got to get them to fork up some money and to make it in their interests. Because here's an important lesson to tell people who are well-to-do that you know. If you're a business owner, if you don't put controls on what's going on with local government, then you're going to find your lunch eaten. You're going to find the klepto-politicians are going to clean your pocket. I have had politicians literally tell me and tell other reporters in my presence things like, you know, I had lots of opportunities to take money, and the reason I'm sort of a public hero and didn't was because I had lots of opportunities, is I knew you or the guy with me would find that out and I'd go to jail. Well, if nobody's watchdogging you, nobody cares. There are still people who will steal. I mean, we literally have videotapes of people who are told they're under FBI surveillance taking money. Stupidity is something you can't solve. But generally, when politicians know they're being watched, they behave better. So one solution is that we need to, in fact, have a much more robust alternative press that is not driven by commercial motives. And that requires contributions to them and donations and getting people to talk about it, which is very important. Secondly, we need to break this campaign finance system, because politicians are like everybody else. They respond to their incentives, okay? And they are going to behave the way they have to keep their jobs if they want to be career politicians. We need to change that. And we need to have a fundamental improvement in this country in something in our education system. You can have a better discussion about economics, politics, or culture with the average waiter or bus driver in rural France, rural Slovakia, out in the sticks in Ontario, Canada, than the average MBA sitting in first class on a jetliner in this country. I tell you this from experience. And the reason is our education system was designed for an industrial era where we wanted people to be obedient robots working in factories and not challenging anything. We don't live in that world anymore. We've got to change that. And we've got to raise people's consciousness about that. And having a vibrant press that is not dependent on ads from the banks and the mutual fund companies and the car dealers and the grocery stores is an absolutely essential element of that, which means you got to do the work. And it's not that hard work. You know, you've got to read, be informed, tell other people, and donate.
Let me ask one point. This is a very good point. You have been an alternative journalist on the LA Times, the New York Times, and as far as all your writing has been mainstream papers in the U.S. and Great Britain. Almost all of it. And I'm just curious, I think the audience here would be very interested in knowing is how the hell you kept your job and how the hell you were able to do this all these years so you can sit there and lay out all these good things for us to think about.
All right.
How have I been able to do it?
All right. Most journalists quote people accurately and don't really know what they're writing about. I read stories every day on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times where I say, this reporter doesn't really understand what they're writing about. You know, the story makes sense and whatnot, but they don't understand. When I was 18 years old and the San Jose Mercury recruited me, one of the first lessons I got was to understand how things worked. So I've only applied for one job in my life, but all these big papers, the Detroit Free Press and the Reuters News Service, where I was their worldwide economics columnist, they all came to me with one exception. New York Times came to me. I never applied for a job there, because I could do something that was valuable. But at every one of these jobs, I knew the day would come when I would have worn out my welcome. And I did. And then I went on to go somewhere else. And most journalists don't operate from any sense of authority. It's what's wrong with the coverage right now of Donald Trump. I've done some of you may know, the toughest pieces that have been out there about Donald Trump, I have a big one that hopefully is going to run tomorrow about Donald being all mobbed up and connected to a big drug trafficker and other stuff. And I have all these journalists who've been sending me emails or calling me on the phone, and my consistent message to them is, write on your own authority. And I've had people say back, what does that mean? And I said, stop reacting to what Donald Trump says. Write on your own. This is what the news is, not what he says. Well, how do you do that? And that's the sort of core problem. So I had a commercial niche, Bruce, that I could exploit because I could do this, and most journalists can't. And I will tell you finally, and this sounds, I know, terribly arrogant, but one of my best friends I have lunch with every month, a wealthy business guy, when I was griping about the press one day, he said, it's not fair of you to pick on your peers the way you do. And I said, why not? He said, because you never should have been a journalist. You were underemployed. You should have gone and been a lawyer or run a business or something like that. And he said, most of the people in journalism, they don't pay for your brains, and you should have gotten paid more and done something else. There is actually some truth to that. I spent a lot of time trying to educate journalists just about how the most basic things work. A masthead editor of the New York Times, and I was shocked, Harvard educated, masthead, the people whose names are in the paper every day. I went to him one day with a clip where we had gotten wrong what a jury did with its verdict. It said the jury handed down a verdict. And he said, what's wrong with that? I said, well, you've been in a courtroom. He says, no, I've never been in a courtroom. I said, well, who sits in the highest chair? I said, you watch Law and Order? He said, I've seen Law and Order. I said, well, who sits in the highest chair in the courtroom? He goes, the jury. And I said, no, the judge. You hand up to a judge. How can you be a masthead editor of the New York Times and not know this most basic, fundamental, and it's all throughout journalism? The issues, Bruce's paper campaigned for years about the fact that the city of San Francisco is supposed to have public power, municipal electricity, which nationwide is 15 to 30% cheaper, even when you take into account paying the equivalent of the property tax. And it's, more importantly, especially in the digital era, it's much more reliable power, far fewer outages. Did the Chronicle ever write about the Raker Act?
No.
No.
I personally won't write about the Raker Act either.
And I wrote about it in the LA Times. By the way, Bruce was not happy with my story at the time and critiqued what was wrong with it. And I was like, I got him to write the story. But people don't even know these basic facts about the city of San Francisco. Where is the story about Rose Pack's private subway over here to Chinatown? Maybe it's a good idea. But I don't even live here. That's got to be Rose Pack's project. I know enough about the city. It has to be. Somehow she got it. That in the Philadelphia Inquirer would have been or the Detroit Free Press, where I also worked, would have been a huge story if it was in their city. How did this happen? None of this is happening. And so people need information. And I figured out how to do this, and I got away with it.
You got away with it because you were a damn good journalist. I assume that in all your stories, the facts are fairly straight. You had things on your own story. It was good authority. You can back it up.
Yeah.
The story didn't bounce. Did you ever have a story that didn't bounce?
I had one screw up in my career when I was at Reuters, my first piece.
I'm sorry.
I had one screw up where a financial document, I reported that the Murdoch's company got a big tax refund because of a financial document. And what I didn't know was that it was for 10 years of their records, that on page 117 of a 400-page document for one of those 10 years, the line appeared that said, certain figures in the current report are based on a new company reporting format. And if I had read that, I wouldn't have known what it meant. But it turned out that they took all the negative numbers and made them into positives and made the positive numbers negative in the place I was writing about. So I was wrong. And I immediately fixed it. Only thing my whole career. But it's a terrible mistake, and I'm embarrassed about it. And places like Newsbusters, beat me up about it every time they get. But I got it wrong. But yeah, you have to get your facts right. You can write lies about the cops all day long. They saved this, they did that, when they didn't do any of it. You never get in trouble. You write about crooked cops and get one comma out of place, and they will be demanding your head. But listen, if nothing else, there's nothing wrong with gigs. There's something wrong with a gig economy. And we can change this. And all we have to do to change it is we have to get the law to match rights and responsibilities, risks and responsibilities. And the way you do that is you have to get people to learn how these things work. And it is not easy. It is not easy to get people to see things and to change. And I don't want to suggest it is, but you know, what did Susan B. Anthony tell us? It is inevitable. She died and women still didn't have the right to vote, but she knew it would happen. It took 80 years. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who like me had 8 children, who led this movement. We can change things. We are powerful if we choose to be. But it means you got to talk to people about it. You got to care about it. You got to compromise. You can't be a purist. You got to recognize that, you know, ideas will ebb and flow and change, and you got to work at it. And the most basic thing you got to do is you got to read. So Tim Redmond's 48 Hills. Tim was with Big Guardian for many times. Very important. This paper, the Public Press. Man, if we get enough money that they could come out every month, and we had 10% of San Franciscans reading it, you'd see change. There would be an enormous change that would take place. So, thank you.
So I want to say thank you to David and Rose for being here this evening.